çıkarını, kendi küresel ve bölgesel hesaplarını hayata geçirmenin çabası için.
From peaceful protest to a global proxy war. Hello, I'm Matthew Moore in Istanbul with part 4 of TRT World's week-long special coverage of Syria's conflict. Coming up in today's programme, fighting for and against Assad, we speak to two men from Hezbollah and Nusra Front who fought on opposite sides in the same battle. Plus the militant group terrorising the world, how the emergence of Daesh has changed the course of the Syrian war. And reluctant to get involved, we examine how and why the US became embroiled in the conflict. This is Syria, 5 years of conflict, the main players. When Syrian security forces began killing peaceful protesters, citizens took up arms to defend themselves. They formed rebel brigades to fight regime forces, and within a year, the uprising had become a civil war. It's pitted neighbour against neighbour, pro-Assad against anti-regime, and Sunni versus Shia. Zaina Awad spoke to two fighters from opposite sides who became fighters in the same battle.
The Battle of Qusair in 2013. It gave the advantage to the Syrian regime and established its ally Hezbollah as a formidable fighting force on the ground.
We are protecting our children and families from this disease. This is a disease of Islam and it is Wahhabism.
Hassan, which is not his real name, was one of the foot soldiers in that battle.
The Wahhabis, be it Daesh or Jabhat al-Nusra, or the Free Syrian Army, or Jaish al-Islam, they are all the same to us.
A lifelong Hezbollah fighter, he's seen here on the outskirts of Damascus. He told us he's been to Syria at least 10 times since the war began.
Any young man who goes there sees this as an honor. When you come back, your family asks, what did you do there? It changes everything.
Ideology definitely plays a role, and you have all the narrative, the demonization of the others, the need to belong to a group, for example, the need to belong to ideals.
We're on our way to meet a Syrian fighter. He too fought in the Battle of Qusair, but on the opposite side. He fought with Jabhat al-Nusra or Nusra Front.
Theft became widespread. When the Islamist militias came, if you stole anything, they would cut off your hand. No one dared to steal after that.
Khattab is now living in a small village in Lebanon, a few kilometers away from the Syrian province of Homs.
The Shias are all fighting us. You can't find a single Shiite person in Syria who isn't supporting the regime. So if there is someone who supports Hezbollah and is fighting me, should I not fight him back? This is why there is hatred.
And it's this hatred that's left a trail of blood behind. What may have started out as a turf war has turned into a holy war for some.
Well, let's look at this more closely now, and Zainab joins us from Beirut. Zainab, we see sectarian hatred in your report, and yet Syrians of all beliefs lived together for years. What changed?
Absolutely. In fact, before the war, Syrians used to pride themselves on the fact that you couldn't tell what religion they were from. They were all Syrians. And when they first rose up against the Assad regime in pro-democracy movements, they did so on the basis of being Syrian. But then what we saw was this intervention of different regional powers in the politics of Syria that crystallized these divisions and really turned it into a confrontation between Sunni and Shia. And we've seen a lot of foreign fighters, not only from Lebanon, but from Iran, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Tunisia, who've entered the battlefield and fought on one side or the other based on the Sunni-Shia division.
Hezbollah's biggest enemy has always been Israel, at least outside of Lebanon. And now we see Hezbollah turning its firepower to Syria. Why is it so important to Hezbollah to save the Syrian regime?
because Hezbollah sees itself as the foot soldiers of this battle between the Iranian current in the region and the Saudi current. It's very geopolitical. Syria is strategically important. There are regions in Syria that are Alawites and that are Shias and that need to be linked from Hezbollah's perspective to the Shia Lebanon in Shia regions in Lebanon. And you're right. In fact, when we were in Dahi, which is the stronghold of Hezbollah in Beirut, every home we walked into, they told us they had at least one son on the front lines. While we were doing our work, somebody who was helping us to do our work, to get our interviews, got a call, and he was told that his own cousin had just been killed in the battlefield in Syria.
Well, let's talk about the other side of this now. You were interviewing Hezbollah and also al-Nusra. We heard the fighter from al-Nusra saying that fighters like him brought security, brought safety and law and order to these areas. Is that really what is motivating them?
Well, I was quite struck by, frankly, the pragmatism that I heard coming from both a Daesh member that I spoke to last week and this Nusra Front fighter as well. Their reasons, the reasons they really joined those movements was really for pragmatic reasons, because these groups brought security into their neighborhoods, because these groups paid money, because in some cases they themselves had defected from the Syrian security forces, and the group that would give them the most support, the most protection, was Daesh or was Nusrat Front. But of course, in addition to that, with protection and with money come strings, and the sponsors of these different groups have brought their own politics to the table, whoever these sponsors may be, and a lot of the times that came with a radical ideology which really changed the dynamics on the ground.
Okay, Zaina Awad in Beirut, thank you. Well, this is a complex war with as many as 1,000 different groups fighting on the ground. They're armed, funded, and in some cases militarily supported by a number of world powers. Let's take a look at the main players.
Russia, Iran and Hezbollah back the Assad regime. On the other hand, Turkey, the Gulf states and some European countries support opposition groups. Daesh and the al-Qaeda-linked Nusra Front are considered as terrorist organizations. They have become a magnet for foreign fighters. But there are disagreements on the nature of some of these groups. The US supports the YPG, the Syrian branch of the terror group PKK. So in Syria, the enemies of your enemies are not always your friends. Officially, all sides are fighting Daesh. Assad's forces are also fighting various rebel groups and the Nusra Front. But they're not fighting the YPG. The YPG also considers the rebels and Nusra as enemies. What are they fighting for? Assad does not want to give up power. The opposition insists on a new Syria without the Assad regime. Daesh and the Nusra Front want to create what they call an Islamic State, and the YPG seeks an independent region. With so many different groups and countries involved in Syria's war, the question remains: can Syria be saved?
Well, the United States was hesitant to get involved in another conflict in the Middle East, but a number of events were to drag in the world's most powerful military. Kilmeny Dukat has this look from Washington.
The cries of ordinary Syrians reached the corridors of the highest office in the U.S., but many Americans were reluctant to intervene, fearing the possibility of another war like the one raging in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Obama administration chose to respond with sanctions and called on Bashar al-Assad to step down.
For us to take military action unilaterally, as some have suggested, or to think that somehow there is some simple solution, I think is a mistake.
Instead, the U.S. armed and trained the opposition and threatened military intervention if chemical weapons were used. A red line the U.S. accused Assad of crossing after these grim images stunned the world.
All told, well over 1,000 people were murdered. Several hundred of them were children. Young girls and boys gassed to death by their own government. Now, after careful deliberation, I have decided that the United States should take military action against Syrian regime targets.
But he didn't. Russia offered to intervene and destroy Assad's chemical weapons stockpile.
At that point, the U.S. stood back, and since then, it's just been, the U.S. has just not crossed the threshold where it's engaged in a major role. It's been trying to work with local allies, foreign governments, and so far none of that's been very effective.
But the U.S. focus quickly shifted from the country's civil war to the rapid expansion of Daesh in not only Syria but Iraq. And critics say that shift gave the Assad regime a free hand to fight moderate opposition groups.
The U.S. put together a coalition to bombard Daesh targets, trying to destroy their supply lines. A year later, Russia launched an aerial campaign to help Assad hit opposition groups. The U.S. then used diplomacy to broker what's been a fragile ceasefire in Syria. But despite its efforts, many accuse the U.S. of not doing enough. Kilmany Dukart, TRT World, Washington.
While nations argue about which militias should be supported, all agree, at least in public, that Daesh is a terrorist group and a threat to international security. At the end of last year, the United Nations Security Council called on all member states to confront the group in Syria and Iraq. Let's take a look now at how Daesh has evolved over the course of the war.
We will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL.
Nous allons choisir des cibles qui feront le plus de dégâts possible cette armée terroriste.
Daesh is genocidal by self-proclamation, by ideology, and by actions.
Gulna Aibet is the director of the Security Studies Center at Başakşehir University, and she says Daesh isn't the only threat in Syria.
When you see Brett McGurk, who is the special representative dealing with the war against Daesh by the US, when he makes this sort of presentation, there's actually a map that's entirely concentrated only on the US-led fight against Daesh, as if there are no other forces on the ground that can actually determine the outcome of what's happening in Syria. So as the end game, if you can call it that, is approaching, I think, in this war, we're not sure, of course, if there will be an end game, but definitely there seems to be a much more common ground between the US and Russia with regards to what should happen in Geneva. As that's taking shape, especially after the cessation of hostilities, then I think, this is the time when the US will be much more pronounced in trying to finish, if you like, that plan, that map they had in wiping out Daesh in these areas.
Well, Division 30 was the name of the controversial US program to fight Daesh. It aimed at training so-called moderate rebels and sending them to Syria. But as Jerome Evans reports, it ended up being a big embarrassment.
It was part of the United States' response to the Daesh threat in Syria, training and arming 5,000 Syrian fighters and sending them to the northern part of the country to set up a safe zone. Munaf Hussein was one of the US-backed fighters. He decided to join the Division 30 program after losing dozens of members of his family. He had 45 days of training.
طلعنا من الطيارة نزلنا في الأردن. التدريب كانت تكتيكات عسكرية للأسلحة، يعني كان تدريب كتير صعب. بهذا التدريب راح تصير منطقة آمنة، يصير فيها حظر طيران، ينمنع فيها فوت النظام أو فوت داعش على هاي المنطقة، ترجع العالم المدنيين تبرك فيها.
But it didn't go according to plan. When the first group of Division 30 entered Syria in August 2015, some were ambushed by al-Nusra Front fighters. Another faction handed over their weapons to the al-Qaeda-linked fighters a few weeks later. The head of US Central Command had to admit the failure of the program in front of a Senate panel.
Can you tell us what the total number of trained fighters remains?
It's a small number, and the ones that are in the fight is we're talking four or five. So.
The US was then forced to review its $500 million program and to find another strategy in its fight against Daesh on the ground.
I wasn't satisfied with the early efforts in that regard, and so we're looking at different ways to achieve basically the same kind of strategic objective.
The US then decided to rely on the Syrian Democratic Forces, an alliance led by the YPG.
طيارة آل كاريب مردكة يعني مثلا تشوفون هبة هوال يتشينن راسن ديرك لدقة شو هدف أخوجي تنا بر هدف أخوت يعني نش طيارة جيبانا يعني ما برولو.
But this strategy has angered Turkey, as the YPG is the Syrian branch of the PKK terrorist group. And it's put an edge on the relationship between Washington and its main allies in the region. Jerome Evans, TRT World.
Well, the number of rebel groups in Syria makes the so-called cessation of hostilities difficult to enforce. In the mountains in northeast Syria, fighters from the Turkmen ethnic minority say they still have to fend for themselves against the Syrian regime forces, and they have lost almost all of their territory. Nicole Johnston reports from the Turkish border.
The mountains in the distance are in Syria, and on this clear day, smoke is rising from the hilltops.
You can hear the bombardment on the Syrian side of the border in the village of Salor. It's one of only 6 the Turkmen still control. And even though officially the fighting on the ground was meant to have stopped, in the Turkmen mountains it hasn't.
In Turkey, we meet the main field commander for all the 2,000 Turkmen fighters battling the Syrian regime. They've already lost 600 men and are losing the battle. We agreed to protect his identity.
4 months ago, we totally controlled the Turkmen mountains. But after Russian jets started bombing, our areas were destroyed. We lost 70% of our land, nearly 32 villages. Only 4 or 5 villages are left.
The Syrian regime now controls most of the Turkmen mountains along the border. So Turkey has closed the Yayladağ crossing. In the last 4 months, 25,000 Syrian Turkmen have fled from their villages. Most of them are now in Turkey, living in this area, either in towns or in camps. Saadettin Mullah arrived 4 years ago. Sometimes he walks up the hills to take in the views across the valley and to Syria. And he can sometimes hear the war.
After the ceasefire, the Russian airplanes stopped hitting the Turkmen villages we still control. But from the land and sea, the bombardment is still continuing. The ceasefire is a big lie.
Fighters are running low on supplies, so Turkish groups are sending aid across the border. Trucks loaded with flour and food. The commander says morale is low and they need more weapons.
We have a saying, until the last village, we will never walk away. We can lose by force, but we can't decide to leave.
And so he will return to Syria and to war.
And Nicole joins us from the Turkish city of Gaziantep now. That's near the Syrian border. Nicole, just explain why the Turkmen and the Syrian regime are fighting in the first place.
Well, the Turkmen told us that initially they tried to stay out of the war, and in fact they did stay out of it for the first year. They said that they joined the war after 12 months when they saw that Turkmen were being killed by the Syrian regime in other parts of the country. So that's when they started to form a force and to properly enter the war. The other reason, of course, that the Syrian regime is after the Turkmen mountains is it's a highly strategic area. It's on the border with Turkey. It's close to the Mediterranean Sea. So this is an area that the Syrian regime would like to control. The Turkmen said that they had to enter the war to not only try and protect other Turkmen, but to try and defend their villages. But as you can see in that report, that has not been going particularly well over the last 4 months. They managed to hold the territory for quite a number of years. But ever since the Russians entered and Russian bombing started in that area, they say that they have lost many villages and they just have not been able to maintain control of the Turkmen mountains.
So, Nicole, we saw in your report that thousands of Turkmen have fled their areas. They've gone into Turkey. We know they're losing territory. Turkey is standing by them. Can you just explain why Turkey has this affinity with them?
That's right. Turkey has been a big ally of the Turkmen. The Turkish people feel a great deal of sympathy with the Turkmens. I mean, the Turkmen are a very small minority in Syria. There's only around 200,000 of them, but they are a Turkish-speaking minority. There are strong cultural ties between the two countries, as well as that Turkey also sees the Turkmens in that Turkmen mountain area as a very important buffer against other groups in the area, such as the PYD, groups that have territorial expansion, that want to move further and further along the Turkish-Syrian border. The other reason, of course, that Turkey is supporting the Turkmen is because the Turkmen are fighting the Syrian regime. OK,
Nicole, do stay with us. We're just going to take another closer look at Turkey's role in this war. Now, Turkey is part of the US coalition fighting Daesh. It's also one of the key supporters of Syrian opposition groups. And as Andrew Hopkins reports, that support has put Ankara increasingly at odds with Russia.
When Turkey shot down this Russian fighter jet on its border with Syria, following violations of its airspace last year, it put the region on edge. Would a full-blown conflict break out? Several months on, it hasn't.
We are not enemy of the Russia. This is number one rule. Number two, we don't want divided the Syria or divided Iraq. The Turkey aim to be bringing solution peaceful manner, according to the United Nations Charter.
Instead, Russia tried to hit Turkey in its pockets. It stopped importing produce, put an end to visa-free travel, and advised its citizens not to go on holiday to Turkey, one of their most popular destinations. But Turkey refused Moscow's demand for an apology, and with NATO voicing its support for Ankara, Russia hasn't gone any further. The fact that Russian military and cargo ships are still using the Bosphorus on a regular basis shows that relations with Turkey didn't reach a major crisis point. Under international law, if there's a war or even a threat of aggression, Turkey would be within its rights to close this waterway to foreign traffic. What Turkey is most concerned about is the security of its own borders. The Ankara bombing last year, which killed 103 people, was one of a series that brought that idea home. That attack was linked to Daesh, but it's not the only terrorist threat. The PKK is fighting the Turkish state in the southeast, and its Syrian affiliate, the YPG, has been linked to other attacks in Turkey. Now it's building a wall along its border with Syria to better control who comes in and out. And demands like this mean it doesn't have enough resources to meet every request of the international community.
The European Union for a long time has not answered Turkey's calls to help Turkey in the past. And once it became a problem of Europe, when the migrants started or refugees started to go to European Union, then they start to ask Turkey to do certain things.
The result of the refugee crisis seems to be that Turkey now has a much stronger hand in negotiations. It's getting billions of dollars in aid and a faster track to EU membership. But even if that doesn't happen soon, a succession of high-level meetings show Europe wants to start a much closer relationship. Andrew Hopkins, TRT World, Istanbul.
Let's go back to Nicole Johnston now in Gaziantep. Nicole, it's plain for everyone to see, so long as this war goes on across the border, Turkey's own security is in peril.
That's right. We've been travelling along the Turkish border from Yayladağ to Kilis. We've seen the tension at those border areas. In Yayladağ, you could hear the sound of the war just on the other side of the border. And also in Kilis, while we were there, rockets were fired over the border. So you can see how unstable the situation is on those border areas. The other big challenge for Turkey at the moment that has emerged in the last 2 days is the PYD inside Syria. Now, this is the Syrian branch of the PKK terror group. It has come out in the last 2 days. It has declared a federation, a federal system of government there. They haven't released details about how this will operate. This is something that is of great concern and threat to Turkey. The last thing that they want is for a group on the Syrian side of the border to inspire an independence movement inside Turkey. So it's a very difficult situation that Turkey is in at the moment. However, on this PYD issue at least, Turkey and Syria, the US and UN are all on the same page. They're all opposed to it.
Nicole Johnson in Gaziantep, thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of our special programme on the main factions fighting in Syria. On Friday, we conclude our week-long coverage by examining Syria's road to peace. Is there any hope on the horizon? Is there any way through the myriad of competing groups and interests in Syria's web of war? Thanks for watching.
Развязал против